Cella System, Superstation, Orbit of Celia, mid-2670. War Chief General Tlac. He was at a loss. His forces were demolished in the blink of an eye, with a ship of his own torn in half from a rupture in space, only for others in the vicinity to be cut down shortly after the arrival of the behemoth's escort, with ships no smaller than a heavy frigate. With the addition of the new forces, also brought with them a renewed stock of munitions that they seemed more than willing to expend. Tlac slouched in his chair, watching upon the numerous monitors of information as he decided upon their next course of action. The central monitor at the forefront of the room still contained the obscurity that was Morrigan, and its display of dots arranged in a circle that moved when it spoke, matching the disturbed portions of the ring with each tone. It continued to dance as the figure spoke.
"But I will state for the record that I must bring you in, alive if possible. You are free to mount a defense within the confines of your station, but note, my wolves are hungry."
The call was disconnected shortly after she ended her sentence. The room was stained in deep silence. Tlac could tell that chaos was on the verge of erupting, and so he took this lull in reaction as a chance to regain control of his command. The station rumbled once more, but the interval between shots had slowed. He wondered if ground teams had managed to seize partial control of the surface cannons, but the fact that they kept firing on them revealed otherwise. It was reported to him that the energy output has been lowered. He wondered what the enemy's tactic was in lowering the output of the attack, as their shield strength was much lower than previous reported. "Shields at 30%, with another rumble against the station," the crewman reported. 26%. With each lightened rumble, it forced Tlac to understand the enemy was buying them time to make peace with themselves, and time to mount any defense he could. "Orlin, prepare the station troops for an attack. I want all hangar doors sealed, and I want all major pathways secured with a turret team. I want to make it impossible for the enemy to take a single inch of this station." Orlin nodded to his orders as Tlac began issuing to the chiefs below him. "See if we can't increase shield regeneration. Prepare to mobilize a concentrated surprise offensive. See if we can't resupply the city with more troops. We need to retake those guns." His orders were rapid, but they were enough to force sense into the young officers. The room regained its busy clamor as orders were relayed and followed. He had felt a sense of normalcy return, albeit he wished they were under different circumstances. Slowly, reports came from the station troops that they had secured the majority of entrances leading to the larger central access spaces. From there, they had set up numerous kill zones on key pathways, while also placing traps beside secondary entries. It was a lot of work in a short time, and he was grateful for their hard work. Knowing firsthand how the Terrans operated, he had effectively signed the death warrants of his own men, and he was sure they knew that. But even as skilled as they are, he was certain that a wall of bullets and plasma fire would put any Terran soldier down. With his defense on the station near completion, he turned to an officer who managed communications. "How does the capital fare for reinforcements?" he asked. The comms officer communicated what he received over word from the ground. From his expression alone, Tlac knew it didn't bode well. "They are not well. We have several troops trying to gain control of the northern cannon, but their marksman support keeps getting neutralized. It appears the enemy may also be well versed in long-ranged combat. We're trying to locate the attacker." Tlac then shifted the subject to what was most important, the reason he fought in the first place. "And what of the council? How are the defenses for the council chambers?" The comms officer tapped away on their screen, mirroring it onto his hollow table before him. "It is where we have diverted the most troops. We have a Halen armored division patrolling the outer streets of the chambers and troops within buildings on the lookout for the enemy. Missile batteries along the perimeter of the city have also been deactivated, but..." The Celian paused, forcing Tlac to urge the chief to address the glaring issue. "But the enemy seem to have launched a full offensive over the city, utilizing what is being reported as metal coffins. This is the first I've seen of such a tactic. Except maybe for the Union." Tlac raised a hand against his speculation and rejected the notion, careful as not to allow any misconceptions of both the Terrans and the Union. Do not mistake the work of the Terrans as quality to compare of the Union. I have seen firsthand the way the Union deploys its forces. At least the Union takes care to deploy their troops in heavily armored ships, but the Terrans, they deliver their troops to a degree that they could block out the sun. And each pod is a single warrior who is more capable than even Bralo's men. The name of a fallen idol rang throughout the room, causing several to look their way, but he continued, "That's right. Those enemy troops you see that have fallen from the sky in coffins were none other than the ones who have felled our greatest warrior." Tlac's tone grew solemn at the mention. He replayed the video from that day. As the ship struggled to maintain a connection of visual acuity, he saw it. The warrior who killed their best warrior, Bralo. He pulled a data chip from his person and connected it to his station, allowing for him to manipulate its contents, and pulled up an item that he had just now remembered. It was a warrior donning much of the same black and gray blotched pattern worn beneath matted steel gray and armor. Contrary to the wealth of soldiers of the same armor that bore white and red markings, the individual before him was donned with gold markings on his pauldrons, chest, and knees, although he surmised that it may just reflect their hierarchy in the field, as reported by troops on the ground, but noted the markings on the once purple glass visor. Most of the surface was carved, leaving only a set of eyes and a smile of jagged teeth. "Him," he voiced, causing many to look upon it in fear. He was the warrior who delivered Bralo his final breath. "Quick, deliver this to all the ground troops. I want him dead, and whoever does will be made chief captain, at minimum." They nodded their heads to his order and began disseminating the photo to all available ground forces. He figured that if this person was present on Draxis, then the probability that they would be in Artre was just as likely. If he couldn't best the Terrans in naval combat, then his next bet would be to take out what he figured was a prominent tactical element. He was certain it would sow chaos among their own and deal a devastating blow to leadership and ground combat. But first, they needed to find him. Tlac then returned his attention to the tactical display at the forefront of the room, and still, the new addition of Terran ships wove their being among his own fleet, intermixing with one another like an unholy amalgamation. And so far, Station Shield showed no signs of replenishing faster than they were depleted, leaving him with only one real option, to face the oncoming boarding, and to hold out long enough to secure a victory, no matter how small. "Once we're boarded, order all ships to attacks." His words were heavy to those who listened, but they understood what needed to be done. Currently, both Celian and Terran ships were interwoven with each other, as battle had ceased with the appearance of the behemoth. They drifted close to each other that a well-coordinated attack could put many enemy ships out of commission. It was a situation he had been waiting for. "Make sure our signal is encrypted before you message them. This needs to be precise and swift, at least until we get the remaining ships from the Torkin system." They gave a collective hurrah as confirmation, boosting morale for the others within their vicinity. After several more shots to the station, a crewman reported that their shields were reduced to 0, and since then, shots from the surface-to-orbit cannons ceased firing, leaving them ultimately vulnerable. "Reporting, Chief General. We've detected explosions of where the cannons were stationed. The enemy seems to have destroyed them," voiced a nearby chief. The field now belonged to the Terrans, and the best he could try to do is stall for time. "Reroute our forces and reorganize for defensive measure, and get me in contact with the Malariv ground troop." The name sparked spurs of confusion among the nearby Celians. The name was not known by many, and they were right to question its existence. "I don't think I've heard of a troop by that name," voiced another Celian. This time it was a female chief in charge of troop placements and relaying of orders. "And you'd be right," began Tlac. "The Malariv troop is not known by many, unlike Bralo's troop, but are just as deadly." Tlac continued, describing their armor as donning of ancient black garbs, dark gray armor on the torso, thigh, and shoulders, with a red sash around their waist. They stuck with the standardized amber-colored visor, but the helmet was accented with glacial blue markings to honor the father that the troop is named after, with the top portion of the helmet colored teal. And with their name, it is as you expect. They are named after Father Malerev, one of the founders of the Celian Empire. He spoke the name in reverence. Tlac then continued, "When you think of Bralo's troop, you know him as the heart of Celian ground combat, bested only by the Terran mentioned prior. But Malerev, they are the monsters at night you teach your children so that they don't stay out late, and they may be just the force we need to counter the enemy offensive, and with missile batteries offline, authorize the use of fighters for the airspace." The female chief acknowledged his orders and began relaying them to the appropriate chain of command. In the time it took for him to issue those orders, Orlin spoke to Tlac, reporting on the latest in Terran movements. All fronts are at a standstill, and the battle cruiser has sent a small strike group of ships to the station. "What kind of ships approach?" beckoned Tlac. "Troop carriers, heavily armored, with no doubt lacking a wealth of warriors," reported Orlin. As his tactical display revealed, a small group of enemy ships wove through the minefield of ships that were his own, but knew if they fired now, it would ruin their ambush. From his analysis, their intended target was the larger hangar bay, which made sense for ships of their size. However, he had previously ordered for all hangar doors to be sealed, so he questioned how they were going to force themselves in. He had expected them to brute force their way in, opting to blow open the hangar doors, but they didn't do that. Sensors reported no external hull ruptures until a chief addressed Tlac and Orlin. "Reporting multiple access to docking collars. We can't override it." Tlac replied, "Notify nearby teams of where the sensors were triggered, and to prepare for combat." "Of course, Chief General," replied the junior chief. Tlac then ordered for visuals to be brought up of areas where his kin mobilized. Many wore the standard troop outfit, but the station guards had their armor colored light gray, with their armor a dark blue. Those in the room looked on as the station guards maneuvered themselves towards the enemy when they came to a doorway. It was one of the long halls that led to one of the docking collars, with enclosed rooms throughout the hall. They led nowhere, with the main pathway being the only way for the enemy to progress through the Hall of Death. Tlac didn't have access to view the hall itself, only the open area where his troops gathered. Beside the hall was also a set of doors that led directly towards the hangar, with the hall leading to the docking ring beside it. The open area was a commissary with balconies normally reserved for restaurants, and flora decorated the large open-air location. Not long after the Terran infiltration, shots of those watching the entrance began ringing out as flashes of light from their barrel as their bodies jolted from the recoil. Those that stood behind the group on risers and balconies awaited the enemy, if they were able to push through. His fear, however, came true when the initial battle line fell. One soldier was clipped in the shoulder, tossing his body to the side from the force of the shot. Subsequently, before he had time to hit the ground and recover, several more shots landed on his torso and head, evidenced by bursts of material from the head and chest that was seen from the monitor. When the body landed, it remained motionless, with a small pool of green liquid forming below the body as it was dragged to cover. That was their first casualty. Tlac, Orlin, and others in the room grimaced at the scene. It was near instance, and the lifelessness of the body forced many below him to question their own existence. It wasn't often that they saw someone, full of life in one moment, then without the next. It was a harsh reality that many had not faced before, since most of their time is looking at colored dots on a screen with a name above them disappearing during combat. But for them, it was their first time seeing a visual of such an act. The trooper that had dragged his downed teammate tried desperately to revive his comrade, and many looked on hoping for the soldier to take a gasp of fresh air, except that time never came. Not long after their first casualty, more followed with his troopers falling to the enemy from the hallway. He was curious as to what had allowed them to progress with what he believed to be heavy defenses, until an explosion came from the entrance. It came from a small canister that generated a flash of light with a loud concussive explosion to pair with it. It was intense enough that many of the troopers placed their hands to their ears, whether if they donned a helmet or not. That was when the Terran soldiers appeared from the doorway. But instead of a body waiting to be cut down, they had with them a shield, similar to the ancient warriors of his people. Except instead of the dynamic and decorated shields of times past, they were a rectangle and made of a dull gray material that covered the head, torso, and thighs. The portion of the shield near the head was angled to allow for the wielder to utilize a firearm while still in cover. Signs of bullets riddled the exterior of the shield, but its integrity held to the onslaught of gunfire from the teams mounted on the restaurant balconies. Tlac watched as the turret teams tried to watch out for their comrades by the entrance, and the enemy took this opportunity to fire an underbarrel attachment to the hesitant turret team, which exploded, leaving the two dead. This gave the enemy breathing room as they executed the barely recovering hallway teams, and the enemy shields placed themselves in such a way that proved for the balcony teams difficult to make decisive shots against their enemy. He hoped they had explosives to rid the enemy of their barrier, but found that they had no such ordnance as they continued to fall to the encroaching enemy. Notify all teams to wield explosive ordnance. The enemy is employing shields, so we need to counteract it, ordered Tlac, with his order being relayed to the numerous chiefs in charge of their teams. Multiple calls began to alarm the room of several more Terran groups assaulting the station, with sounds of gunfire bleeding through their comms and with the scenes playing out throughout the station as they cycled the camera feeds. His station was now a war zone with rapid gunfire and explosions exchanged between parties. He grew anxious to his predicament as they closed in. But with their own soldiers now aboard the station, he enacted his plan. Notify all ships, begin firing and focus fire on the larger ships first. Target their cannons once you burn their shields with plasma cannons, he said demandingly. Tlac had noticed that firing missiles and regular shells did little against the Terran shields, but noticed how much damage their shields took when bombarded with plasma, then finished off with a regular cannon and missile barrage. Although he felt he was too late to utilize this realization to its fullest. His next best idea was perhaps to send information to surviving fleets who wished to fight on, and to the Union, for their inevitable clash of the Terrans. At his order, his ships began firing into the ships that made up most of their casualties, the frigates and cruisers, and bombarded their shields with overcharged plasma shots. They flickered greatly, but a second volley finished the job, leaving the first enemy frigate vulnerable to a concentration of shots from the Celian ships that surrounded it. Of course, this attack also spelled the end for many crews, with many ships suffering destruction at the hand of a single salvo of an entire broadside. His heart sank with each fallen ship, but knew that they couldn't go down without fighting. When he had resigned to his seat and watched as the battles raged out in space and within the interior of his station, he received a call that was directed from a chief that he had ordered previously. It was of the chief commander of the Malariv troop, and its leader was now on the other line. "Ah, Chief General, I was hoping you would call. To what do I owe the pleasure?" A Celian with a dark blue complexion and graying hair peered at him from the screen, his hair tied in a traditional knot with a headdress sharing a dark red hue, similar in color to the sash over his waist, with a glacial blue set of beads woven through the fabric that matched with his facial markings. "Mariv," Tlac began, "I have a mission for you, and it needs to be done before day's end. Think you can manage?" Mariv gave a smile that yearned for a fight. "Of course. My troop is already en route to the city, and we will be meeting with a local chief in charge of defenses." Tlac appreciated his timeliness, but wished he did so earlier. "I have sent to you a photo of a warrior I want dead," he said, referencing the photo of the golden-marked warrior with purple-hued eyes and a mouth that smiled like it was laughing. Mariv grew curious of the photo he received, urging Tlac to explain. "That's the warrior who felled Bralo and his troop. He's a threat, and all caution should be made when dealing with him. I can only guess that their targets are the Council." Mariv's demeanor had changed, as if pondering the request. "Very well. I can't exactly deny the orders of a general." He gave a hollow laugh. "I'll see what I can do, but I will not jeopardize my troopers if the objective is already lost. If it's the council they want, fine, but I'll do it for Brallo." His cooperation went smoother than Tlac anticipated, but offered leniency with his order. "I ask only for death of the warrior with gold brands and a demon's face, not for you to try your hand at the entire force. Just him." Mariv nodded with understanding and gave a departing gesture before cutting the call. "Until next time, Tlac. May the fathers watch over you." Tlac then returned to his focus to the larger threat before him, the fleets of ships surrounding the orbit of his home and the troops within his station. He had now left the city to the charge of their respective chief commanders, while he would focus his immediate threats. With the changes in combat, his ships were faring better than before, as many had already dealt with many of the smaller Terran escort ships, with less damage to the larger ships. But even in the midst of battle, he noticed that the largest enemy ship had not yet fired its guns, instead taking the brunt of damage by allocating its enormous energy output to shields. No matter how much they pelted it, it was too well defended to breach, so he had ordered all efforts to focus on the surrounding ships. Of course, its lingering presence stuck fear into Tlac, and he waited for the beast to wake. Even though he changed tactics for how to now challenge the Terran ships, his Celian brethren were still diminishing from the newly arrived fleet. None had fired into the station with maybe a stray round, but overall, the station was not a target, or he would already be dust. His worry was now at an all-time high as his forces dwindled, both in the void and in the station. Cycling through the video feeds of the station, he had now noticed a dramatic decrease in station guards and found mostly the Terran fighters roaming about. And this time, instead of the gray and black armored warriors, there was now a presence of a green-colored warrior roaming alongside their darkened comrades. They didn't wear full helmets either, instead opting for a helmet with no facial visors or protection, except for perhaps a pair of colored glasses over their eyes, which varied from orange and black. Cycling further on the feeds, Tlac came across a wealth of Celian troopers in bindings, organized in rows and several columns. Guards were posted around the spacious room, preventing many the urge to fight back. Fortunately, there were still various fronts on the station defending valiantly against the enemy, holding back what seemed to be larger groups of enemy soldiers. Unfortunately, their fronts were too far from his section of the station, and looking through the feeds, noticed that many along the route to the command center were either nothing but motionless bodies or prisoners. There were just more of the former than of the latter. Before he could realize how far that had gone, he heard shots from behind the door to the command center. His time was up, and now was the time to take out as many as possible. "My warriors, to arms!" he ordered, directing their attention to the doors to their rear. Many grabbed reserved weapons placed on a rack near the doors, and the internal security formed the first line of defense, a quality he appreciated with the ground forces, unlike many of the cowering fleet crew. He cycled the cameras, now focusing on the area just outside. Soldiers with shields flanked the sides of the opening, with more soldiers stacked behind them in close proximity. A tactic he was new with, but forced it to the back of his mind. He then noticed an individual tinkering with the door's access panel, but with a shake of their head, silently notified his superior that the doors couldn't be unlocked manually. Well, of course, we secured power to those panels, he thought to himself. He made sure to secure power so that an individual couldn't manually force override the doors open. It was a failsafe he hoped would stall them in time for a team to engage the intruders, but that wouldn't come to pass. Instead, the same individual that fiddled with the door panel now moved to a point in the door between where the shield users faced, prompting Tlac a bout of confusion. He placed 2 gray mats that folded out into a medium-sized rectangle which were placed vertically beside each other. When he was done, a line was fed from each as they retreated to the end of a stack of soldiers. When it looked like the individual pressed a device in their hands, the 2 devices on the doors began to light up, tracing the rectangle in its entirety. From what he was able to observe, the light from the feed now translated to his side of the door with a glowing yellow and orange line forming a rectangle. Before he could observe them more, the feed was cut and only static played, leaving only him and his crew to face the doors as the molten frame neared completion. He grew with anticipation, as did the others, to the upcoming breach. It grew silent with only the beeps and hums of monitors to fill the air, aside from the tool piercing their door. Orlin readied his rifle, and Tlac did so with a handgun. When the yellow frame was completed, there was a brief lull in his hearing, and with it, silence. Several seconds went by, and a security guard's curiosity grew, prompting them to approach the door. In opposition to Tlac's call to return, the guard approached the door with his rifle at the ready. Before Tlac could recall the soldier, an explosion came from the door, covering the entrance with smoke and debris, leaving the soldier riddled with holes from pieces of the door that barely left anything recognizable of the trooper. However, even with minimal sight, they saw no silhouette in the doorway, causing them not to fire. To him, that was their biggest mistake, because as several of the guards rounded the entrance, several gray canisters were tossed into the room almost en masse. One landed right between himself and Orlin, who looked down at the item in curiosity. It was an elongated cylinder filled with holes along the central tube, with a blue stripe rounding the center. But before he or Orlin could do anything, the wealth of canisters exploded, blinding him and all others within the vicinity, along with a deafening ringing that pierced their ears. With how sensitive their ears are, the effect was that much more devastating. As Tlac tried to regain his bearing, he felt a pressure on his wrists as they were placed behind him, and felt a shock to the back of his knees, forcing him to the ground. When his eyes began recovering, he looked to see that the room was filled with Terrans as they began putting his brethren in binds. Those not entire affected by the canisters tried to fight, firing shots from their weapon before being put down themselves, until none were left to resist. His ears were ringing, but Tlac was brought to the forefront of the group to the improvised doorway, where he was met with an individual who was clothed differently than the surrounding soldiers. He wore a gray-dominated outfit, with dark blue accents along the creases of the uniform, and the symbol of a bird wrapping its talons on a wreath with a star above its head was stitched on his chest. There were 4 stripes stitched on the cuff of the sleeves, and 3 silver stars were placed on his collar. His hair was black with graying sides, and his skin was lightly tanned and aged from years of service, and his amber-colored eyes pierced his own. Tlac struggled to talk, fighting off the effects from earlier, but felt his hearing recovering as voices from around him made its way to his ears, with a light ringing persisting. "Is this him?" The aged man spoke to the black and gray warrior. "Yes, sir. With the data from earlier systems and the assistance of Minerva, this is the one and only," replied the soldier. The man before him grabbed his chin, moving his head from side to side to inspect it. "Well, would you look at that?" the man said, prompting a soldier to humor his superior's inquiry. "You don't see eyes like these very often, wouldn't you say?" The soldier in question nodded and gave a short reply. "No, sir. First I've seen of them. You?" "With an honorary Celian in service to 7th Fleet, his eyes are similar, sharing the same yellow ring on the edges of the pupil and those slits, just like a cat's," the man said, disregarding Tlac's obvious discomfort. When he tried to speak, his head was thrown to the side with disregard, as if bored with his new fancy. "I don't think I gave you permission to speak, Tlac," said the man. His authority was heavy, and it weighed on him like 1,000 planets. He then realized the position he and his kin were in. They had lost, and he was captured. As he remained on his knees, he then overheard the man speak into thin air, with none of the soldiers beside him paying mind to his conversation. "Well, how fares the situation in the city? I see. Very well. Scour the city for the targets and bring them in, alive. Carry on then." The man then turned his attention to Tlac, who slumped in his posture, with little energy to keep himself up. "Well, let's take you in, shall we?"